Hello, I'm Paul Zimmy Finn, and this is the Generation Report. Think for a moment back to the times in your life when you were getting ready to wrap up summer vacation and go back to school. Chances are you usually started thinking about preparing to go back while you were outside in the warm air, playing a game or swimming or relaxing. More than likely, your parents slipped a reminder in right about then. It was irritating, wasn't it? But you went with your parents to your local school supplies outlet or department store to get ready for the new school year anyway. I know, you were forced to. But it was also because you knew the season was about to change, and you knew that you needed to change with it. This is just one among countless examples of how cyclical rhythms influence our thoughts, decisions, and actions every day. Although modern civilization offers innumerable outlets to forget or fight against the cyclical rhythms that infuse our world, we still live by these rhythms in the end. All living things abide by the cycle of the seasons, and the shifts in the environment brought by that cycle, in order to survive. If no connection existed between the seasons and patterns in the lives of living things, geese would never be certain when to fly south, bears would never be certain when to come out of hibernation, and there would be no pattern to when school vacations end and new school years begin. Retailers would have ceased stocking their shelves with school supplies in midsummer a long time ago. Of course, we live in a world which is marked by seasons, in nature, in life, and in history. The rhythm of the seasons in nature is familiar to everyone. Spring brings thaw and blooming of new life. Summer brings warmth and saturation. Autumn brings harvests, falling leaves, and deepening chill. Winter brings cold that ushers in the death of the old and clears way for the birth of the new. Year over year, there is always some variation in how the seasons manifest. Some years, the ice melts from rivers and lakes in late March. Some years, the ice melts in early April. Some years, the heat index peaks higher on the hottest day than others. Some years, the leaves change to color before mid-October, some years after. Some years, snow blankets the ground on Christmas. Other years, it doesn't. For all these variations in the seasons year over year, however, the characteristic attributes of the four seasons themselves remain constant. It is the rotation of the Earth in its periodic orbit around the Sun which brings about the recurring cycle of conditions in the natural environment that produces the seasons. A process of birth, growth, saturation, entropy, and death is the roadmap nature's seasons follow, producing four phases to a cycle which always repeats in the same order. Spring is the growth season, summer is the saturation season, autumn is the entropy season, and winter is the death and rebirth season. Major climate disruptions aside, there have been precious few natural seasons which were skipped over, and there has never been a cycle where spring was followed by autumn was followed by summer was followed by winter. For such an occurrence to take place would mean growth followed by entropy, followed by saturation without growth, followed by death without entropy. In other words, an impossibility. Nature confers the same basic life rhythm on all it bears into the world. Every living thing, plants, trees, insects, birds, whales, humans, embarks on a life cycle which, if lived out fully, mirrors the cycle of the seasons, without the rebirth part, of course. Birth is followed by growth, is followed by saturation, is followed by entropy, is followed by death. No other sequence is possible. Living things have their own growth seasons, saturation seasons, entropy seasons, and death seasons. In humans, this takes the form of four life cycle phases: childhood, young adulthood, midlife, and elderhood. Just as seasons in nature are approximately but not precisely equal in length, human life cycle phases are approximately but not precisely equal in length. Just as each season in nature has a characteristic rhythm, each human life cycle phase has a characteristic rhythm, born of the convergence between biology and socialization. Each phase, like a season in nature, has a moment of discontinuity. As these moments of discontinuity come approximately 20 years apart, the life cycle phases of a human life are approximately 20 years long. The four life cycle phases of a human life equal a typical long human life, and the phases always repeat in the same order. A human life is seasonal. The season-by-season rhythm breaks down as follows. Childhood, the spring of the seasons of life, courses a path of growth from birth to coming of age. In the words of Strauss and Howe, this is, quote, the time for growing and learning, acquiring competence, accepting protection, and absorbing traditions at the behest of elders, unquote. Most everyone of an age sufficiently young to be dependent on the resourcefulness, provisioning, and dutiful sacrifices of others is in childhood. Childhood ends at the coming-of-age moment, the pivot point when a person can be said, through experience and adoption of responsibility for their own personal outcomes, to have become an autonomous adult. Young adulthood, the summer of the seasons, courses a path of saturation from coming of age to assuming reins of leadership. According to Strauss and Howe, this is, quote, the age for converting dreams and ideas into projects and plans, for launching careers and families, for soldiering, for providing the muscle and energy of society, unquote. Most everyone of an age sufficient to be personally autonomous, but insufficiently experienced to hold top leadership positions, is in young adulthood. Young adulthood ends when, through experiencing signs of physical aging and expectations of leadership rather than followership, a person realizes they are no longer part of the ascendant group of adults. Midlife, the autumn of the seasons, courses a path of entropy from assuming the reins of leadership to relinquishing the reins of leadership. In the words of Strauss and Howe, this is, quote, the age for confirming lifestyles, implementing ideas and dreams, realizing projects and plans, mentoring young adults, setting standards for children, and taking the mantle of power, unquote. Most everyone of an age with the preferred energy and experience to competently assume top leadership positions within governments, businesses, schools, and communities is in midlife. Midlife ends when, through shifting from leadership to stewardship, or opting for leisure at the expense of a regular work rhythm, a person cedes the brunt of their responsibilities to younger hands. Elderhood, the winter of the seasons, courses a concluding path from the relinquishing of leadership responsibilities to the end of life. According to Strauss and Howe, this is, quote, time for engaging in leisure and reflection, for retiring from the exhausting duties of career and family, for passing the reins to younger hands, and providing the strategic wisdom every society needs, unquote. Most people of an age between formal retirement and passing on from natural causes is in elderhood. In this context, elderhood implies that most of such an age remain able enough in body and mind to play a continuing role in influencing society's direction. Although there are many people who lose that capacity within their old age or live for an exceptionally long time, longer than the typical long life, that does not change the fact that people beyond their working years do deeds, handle responsibilities, and possess insights younger people do not. Therefore, the seasonal dimension is just as enduring for elderhood as it is for the other phases of life. Now that we have established that there are 4 seasons in a long human life, how does that apply to history? First, let's revisit 6 principles already covered. A typical long human life, approximately 80 years, is equal to the approximate length of a typical cycle of history, a saeculum. Each of the 4 phases of a typical long human life is of approximately similar length, about 20 years long. Each of the 4 phases of a human life has a distinct rhythm from the converging influences of biology and socialization. A human life is seasonal. Each approximately 20-year phase of a human life, thanks to its distinct biological and social rhythms, has its own seasonal dimension. An approximately 80-year saeculum is generated by the actions of people reshaping their social environment during their lifetimes. Now, building off these backbone principles, we can also make the following statements. Since the social environment changes according to the life rhythms of the people who live through it, the social environment undergoes fundamental change approximately every 20 years. The social environment moves through 4 phases over the course of a saeculum. Just as there are 4 seasons in a year, just as there are 4 life cycle phases in a human life. The 4 phases of a saeculum each last about 20 years. The 4 approximately 20-year phases of a saeculum pass in the same sequential order, just as nature's seasons and human life cycle phases pass in the same sequential order. The 4 approximately 20-year phases of a saeculum recur in their sequential turn on a fairly predictable schedule, just as nature's seasons do each year. The saeculum has 4 seasons. History has 4 seasons. Strauss and Howe's generational theory framework refers to the 4 seasons of the saeculum as turnings. Each is given a number according to its sequential place in the saeculum: first, second, third, and fourth turnings. Each is characterized by a prevailing social mood that unifies the period from its beginning to end. Just as every season in nature reshapes the contour of the environment, just as every life cycle phase reshapes a human life, every turning of history plays a role in reshaping America. First turnings. The first turning of the saeculum is the spring of the turnings. Just as communities re-engage with their natural surroundings after months spent insulating themselves from frost and howling winds, as farmers take to their fields after the thaw to plow and plant, so too does society converge, fortify, and build during first turnings. First turnings are times of maximal social order. The recent fear for group survival and need for dutiful sacrifice manifests in a communal prioritization on strength, investment, and growth. This, in turn, brings about periods defined by institutional solidarity, commercial prosperity, and political stability, along with often stifling conformism, groupthink, and suppression of the non-mainstream and unconventional. With broad public support, large institutions undertake projects and plans of great scale and make their maximum imprint upon the patterns of daily life. Personal risk-taking, crime, and substance abuse reach their lowest points, and manners seldom stray from the traditional. Gender distinctions reach their widest point, and secure families give increasing indulgences to children. Meanwhile, an old cultural regime begins to be challenged by those who find themselves off-put by, or excluded from, the values of the majoritarian core. First turnings approach their moment of discontinuity when, in Strauss and Howe's words, quote, "Civic life seems fully under control but distressingly spirit-dead. People worry that, as a society, they can do everything but no longer feel anything." Unquote. An era that began with harmony between the institutions and culture winds down with many believing the institutions too powerful and the culture in need of an overhaul. First turnings are referred to as highs. A high's social mood prioritizes the consolidation and strengthening of the institutions built and defended during the prior crisis. The most recent example of a high in American history was the period from demobilization after World War II to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, from approximately 1946 to 1963. Second turnings. The second turning of the saeculum is the summer of the turnings. Just as nature lovers follow trails and off-road paths toward lush, warm destinations, as crowds of strangers gather at concert venues, immerse themselves in music, and then scatter, so too does society individuate, exult, and dream during second turnings. Second turnings are times of diminishing social order. The conformity and security of the high, seen as benevolent during the period itself, are now seen as intrusive and dehumanizing, and as having infringed upon the rights and yearnings of individuals and non-assimilated groups to an unacceptable degree. This, in turn, brings about periods defined by youth-fired attacks against institutions, the insertion of new ideas, meanings, and symbols into social discourse, and an ascendant culture of spiritualism and individual self-expression. As a parallel, these periods also bring deteriorating public decorum, tension to the point of rancor within families and between generations, and rises in violence and in the prevalence of risk-prone lifestyles. Gender distinctions narrow, and as the emphasis on self-actualization spreads, families weaken and underprotect children. Second turnings approach their moment of discontinuity when, according to Strauss and Howe, quote, the enthusiasm cools. Having left the old cultural regime fully discredited, internal enemies identified, comity shattered, and institutions delegitimized. Unquote. An era that began with stirrings of dissent between a powerful institutional establishment and emergent and passionate cultural forces winds down with the institutions greatly weakened and a new culture firmly in place. Second turnings are referred to as awakenings. An awakening social mood prioritizes the releasing of individuals from old social customs and the establishing of new values in the culture. The most recent example of an awakening in American history was the period from the campus and inner-city revolts of the Great Society years to the alarm over AIDS and other new public hazards in the early Reagan era, from approximately 1964 to 1983. Third turnings. The third turning of the saeculum is the autumn of the turnings. Just as summer revelers return to their homes and reassume their workaday routines, as farmers go out to their fields to reap the harvest and put any excess yields away, so too does society diverge, consume, and store during third turnings. Third turnings are nadir times for social order and civic cohesion. Pragmatism, fragmentation, and self-reliance are prioritized as the new cultural regime put in place by the awakening takes hold. This, in turn, brings about periods defined by ebbing public trust, maximal personal risk-taking, and harsh debates over values. With civic authority weakened, speculators and enterprisers dominate the free market, and aberrant personal behavior peaks just as it begins to come under renewed criticism. As people scatter apart and arguments induce dysfunction in the public square, cynicism spreads, and community problems are continually deferred. Gender distinctions reach their narrowest point, and feeling a newfound uncertainty and anxiety about the future, families re-strengthen and give increasing protections to children. Meanwhile, an old institutional regime steadily corrodes. Third turnings approach their moment of discontinuity when, as Strauss and Howe observe, quote, approaching specter of public disaster elicits a mix of paralysis and apathy previously unthinkable. People can now feel, but collectively can no longer do. Unquote. An era that began with confidence in the culture and a lack of confidence in the institutions winds down with many believing the culture exhausted and the institutions broken. Third turnings are referred to as unravelings. An unraveling social mood prioritizes the exploring of individual possibilities according to the cultural values established during the prior awakening. The most recent example of an unraveling in American history was the period from mourning in America individualism in the middle Reagan years to the onset of the subprime mortgage crisis, from approximately 1984 to 2007. Fourth turnings. Finally, the fourth turning of the saeculum is the winter of the turnings. Just as people congregate in warm and inviting homes to get out of the cold, as people cooperate to help shovel neighbors out of snowed-in driveways, so too does society focus, pitch in, and band together in the face of struggle during fourth turnings. Fourth turnings are times of rising social order, in which a mood of urgency coalesces as a response to threats seen as dire which, during the unraveling, would have been ignored or deferred. The simplest of imperatives emerges in response to this shift in mood. The society must prevail. Solid public consensus, aggressive institutions, and personal sacrifice are paramount to achieving this, and aggressive measures are taken to ensure their actualization. The old splintered culture of the unraveling gives way to a new homogeneity, filtered through various top-down transmissions of propaganda. As civic authority gains sway over private life, manners traditionalize, rates of violent crime and substance abuse decline, and relations between generations reach their point of maximum harmony. Gender distinctions widen, families reach their point of maximum strength, and children receive maximal protection and structure, often to the point of smothering. Fourth turnings eventually become defined by widespread feelings of, in Strauss and Howe's words, quote, exhaustion, relief, and optimism. Buoyed by a newborn faith in the group and in authority, leaders plan, people hope, and a society yearns for good and simple things. Unquote. An era that began with institutional dysfunction and cultural degeneration winds down with reconstituted authoritative institutions and a repurposed, unifying culture. Fourth turnings are crises. A crisis social mood prioritizes the cooperation of the community in the face of worldly perils, and the establishing of new institutions to bring people together in common identification and purpose. America is in the midst of a crisis at this very moment. William Strauss passed away in 2007. According to Neil Howe's calculations, this crisis began with the near collapse of the U.S. and global financial systems in 2008 and has continued through to the present. The most recent example of a completed crisis era in American history was the period from the October Wall Street crash to the achieving of victory in World War II, from approximately 1929 to 1945. Just as the winter thaw is the moment of discontinuity for the seasons in nature, the resolution at the conclusion of the crisis is the moment of discontinuity for the saeculum. A society has been transformed beyond prior recognition by an effort of common sacrifice, one which could not have been summoned without powerful institutions and shared values. At these moments, a cycle of history literally comes full circle. Moving forward, the society proceeds in solidarity with its reconstituted institutions, but without the same pitch of total urgency as before, planting the first seed for cultural changes down the road. A crisis has given way to a high and a new cycle of history. History's winter, turning to history's spring. Please tune in to the next episode, Generational Theory Part 3. Social influences, locations in history, and generations. Thank you for listening.